This is our first winter Pillow Talk, so we are delighted to have you on this journey with us as we explore what it's like to be here when the snow is flying rather than the pollen of the summer. But I want to welcome in particular Paul Scolieri, who has been welcomed to the Pillow many a time and will be welcomed again this summer because we'll be doing a summertime edition Pillow Talk with him in July to talk further about the book. I mean, one of the things that we will be discovering in this talk, and certainly as you read the book that you'll discover, is that there is so much information in here that we could very well have many of these conversations. We did already have one conversation in New York at the National Arts Club back in November, which was just at the moment of publication, which was exciting. I want to read just the two lines of, he has the most modest bio on the book jacket, which just says, Paul Scolieri is chair and professor of dance at Barnard College, Columbia University, and the award-winning author of Dancing the New World, Aztecs, Spaniards, and the Choreography of Conquest. So, welcome, Paul Scolieri.
Thank you, Norton. And thank you, Anastasia, and thank you all. Thank you so much for being here.
I wonder if you want to open with it. You have an anecdote that you mentioned to me because we're all learning how to bump elbows and do things other than shake hands and embrace each other. And Paul mentioned that he has a Spanish flu anecdote to share.
Well, I was thinking about Ted Shawn and how he was one of the most resourceful people in history and how he would be reacting to all of the news. And I was thinking about how during World War I, he was at Camp Kearney in California. And while he was a soldier there, and Ruth St Denis, his famous wife, who was performing throughout the country, raising money for the war effort, would come by to the camp every so often to perform for the troops. Well, during the height of the Spanish flu season, the soldiers were quarantined, but that would not keep Ted Shawn from a show going on. So he actually had Ruth St. Denis perform for the soldiers on the stage, but he and Ruth performed the same duet just 10 feet away from each other on the stage. So he would not let a quarantine stop him, so I'm glad that we're here all
it's
here today.
It's not going to stop us either,
Right.
Absolutely. So actually your mention of Ruth St. Denis reminds me, there was one, so in the really terrific interview, which is in this month's Berkshire magazine, which as Anastasia mentioned, we have copies here, so please pick up one if you haven't seen it already. But one of the things that I found surprising in that interview was your answer to her question, who was his biggest love? And tell us what you answered to that.
I'm so glad you asked. I was thinking about that when Anastasia and I had the Q&A here at the Pillow. It was great in January, and we talked for well over an hour, and so there are lots of things I came across. But driving home, I realized, I think she asked me who was the greatest love of Shawn's life. And this book is, in part, a way to affirm Shawn's homosexuality and the men in his life and how important a vision of the queer world was to his dance making. But my answer to her was Ruth St. Denis. But I do think that is true, actually. And maybe what I had in mind was what was the most consequential love, or what was the most consequential,
and the longest lasting.
The longest lasting. And and I would still answer that way today, but I do think it was the relationship that changed everything for him. He met her when he was still very young, and she was already an established performer, or world-renowned performer at the time. And I think for many years, history has treated Ted Shawn as if he was an opportunist who met this famous woman and then rode her coattails. But one of the great, into his own fame, but one of the great discoveries I made in studying his life was to see how her really evolving relationship towards Ted Shawn, and later on really beginning to have a really deep respect and admiration for him and the work that he did, both as a performer, as someone who built the pillow as someone who was able to sustain a career in the arts in a way that she wasn't able to by herself, not from a management perspective.
So you think that really changed over time? That her perspective on him changed over time, is what you're saying?
Absolutely, I do. I think there was a tremendous falling out with them, particularly around the time when they both fell in love with the same man.
That would be a problem, yeah.
But but the problem wasn't the man. The problem was that I think they both had visions of love. They had a vision of how to relate with one another, an idea of romance and what divine love was that was years ahead of where they were. And so I think, we could say Ruth St. Denis spent a lot of her time thinking that she was queer. Although she fell in love with men, she had deep and intense relationships with men who were gay. And Ted Shawn later, after his marriage with Ruth St. Denis, lived as a gay man. But I think it wasn't about the sexuality. They both had aspiration and a vision for relating that was beyond the sort of confines of heterosexual matrimony.
Well, that reminds me, there was one passage in the book, or one quote that I wrote down, because I think in terms of speaking of him as a gay man is in a sense, a misnomer, because that didn't exist. And one of the things, I think it's in the introduction, you say, when Shawn was a young boy, he could never have fathomed that he would be a male dancer, a modern artist, or a homosexual, as none of these concepts had yet to exist. That's just an amazing thing to recognize, that in all three of those areas that it was uncharted territory.
Right. And what the book tries to sort out is how those areas of modernism, homosexuality, and dance all intersect throughout his life. And he's sort of, this is reductive, but the Forrest Gump of modern dance, because everywhere there's a moment, a defining moment, or a piece of writing, Shawn seems somehow connected to it. He was there he was a mentee of Havelock Ellis. He was a member of the Kinsey study. He was there for Lucian Price, who was one of the first writers to publish gay fiction. He was who was also a mentor to Gore Vidal. So part of what I try to do in this book is just sort out and limb a picture of how Shawn was reaching out to all of these writers, scientists, thinkers who were at the cutting edge, trying to define these different experiences that define American modern life and masculinity and modernity. Also Katherine Dreyer, who was really the founder of what became modern art in the United States. She was actually one of the artists who presented during the first major modern art exhibit.
The Armory Show.
The Armory Show, thank you. She was one of those, and then later built Société Anonyme, which was a collective of modern artists that brought modern art to the United States. She sponsored Shawn, and she began to experiment as being an impresario in the performing arts, in the modernism with Shawn. So here he was with really major figures who were defining what modernism was, what sexuality meant, and what dancing could be. And he was really at the intersection of those trajectories.
Yeah, one of the most surprising things I think about the relationship with Katherine Dreyer was that there were really two major proteges, you would say, of hers that she helped support, and they were Ted Shawn and Marcel Duchamp, two very different artists, and it was through Dreyer that Duchamp came to Jacob's Pillow in 1936. It didn't seem to have been a long-lasting relationship, but there are photographs of Duchamp visiting Jacob's Pillow in 1936, because they were both Shawn and Duchamp were under Dreyer's wing.
Right. Dreyer wanted them to collaborate, as she wanted Shawn to work with many of the artists that she was associated with. But Shawn was enticed by the world of modern art, but did not necessarily see himself as a modern artist at that time.
Mm-hmm. So I want to just read, in terms of you were talking about some of the different threads, and Kinsey being one of them, but the research that you did, I think, extends way beyond what we have here at Jacob's Pillow, or even what exists at the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, which certainly is the mother lode of Shawn and Den Shawn material. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about some of the places that you conducted research and what you found there.
Sure. So, Shawn's, I want to start off by saying one of the remarkable things about Ted Shawn was that the volume of material that he saved, he knew he was special from the very beginning, because you do not save things of the order that he saved them at a time when, he did not have space or a stable home, or, for long periods of his life. Actually, until he was very senior, did he actually have a place, a permanent residence that he called home. That didn't stop him. Yeah. And also you need to know about the great luxury of doing research with Ted Shawn was that he also went on the road in a truck that could barely make it 3 stops without needing a tune-up, but he brought his typewriter. So every morning he would conduct his correspondence, and later years he would do it in carbon copy. So as a biographer, you're ordinarily just reading the one end of a correspondence, but with Ted Shawn, he filed, in many instances, it's not for throughout his life, obviously, but we have letters outgoing and incoming, so it was just amazing to know that. But he was a collector of his own life, and a curator of his own story, and that's part of what I'm trying to tell in this book, was that no one told Ted Shawn's story better than himself until he realized that he really couldn't tell the story himself and wanted someone else to write it for him.
Well, if I can share one, this also I think is from the introduction. You wrote that he scrupulously archived his journals, correspondence, programs, photographs, and motion pictures of his dances, anticipating that the full significance of his life, writing, and dances would reveal itself in time. So it's quite it's quite a tribute to his documentation and his own awareness that his life was worth documenting.
Right. So, and also to give you a sense, he wrote starting in 1941, just as many of you may know, he helmed the first all-male dance company that toured between 1933 to 1940. And by the end, 1940, most of those dancers who were young men were drafted into the military or involved in the war effort of some kind. And he was here, right here. I mean, it's amazing to tell the story back here. He was here at the Pillow with the promise that he would keep things running so they had a place to return. Like that, he felt, was his solemn oath to them. And so there's that. And how he kept himself busy during those early years was he thought it was time to write his own life story. So between 40 and 47, 48, he began writing his own memoir, which was 650,000 words, and only up until the year 1948. And that book, that story, wasn't published until much later, until 72. And we were talking about word counts in books. I think that book is only 30,000 words. So it was just a sliver. And he saw it as, it was his story. It was 100 nights, 1,001 night stands, thank you. He saw it as a great failure on his part because it didn't really tell the truth of his experience in life. And so after Ruth St Denis died, and really I would say in the late 60s, once he started to see cultural shifts happening around gay culture, and he began to see plays like Boys in the Band, or he began to see Mike Wallace did a famous report on the homosexual, and he saw gay literature and culture beginning to emerge, he really said, my life is part of this story, and my dances matter, and part of what precipitated this cultural shift. And he felt desperately to retell the story of his life. And so he did that by bringing John Doherty, who is a former dancer of his, someone who worked closely with Miss Ruth in writing her book. He brought Shawn brought John Doherty out to his home in Florida and began to retell the story of his life. And he bought all these audio cassettes and said, we're going to spend January and I'm going to dictate to you anecdotes and stories that I hadn't told before. And so this sounds great. And he begins to do that. And during the first week, they start covering, it's amazing, and these tapes exist, and there's a transcript of these tapes. It was basically the story that Ted Shawn had not yet told, but wanted to tell, and really gave me at least a sort of clues as to which direction I needed to take this material. Unfortunately, on, I believe it was the 13th night, he was telling, no it wasn't, it was the 8th night, he was telling John Doherty about his relationship to Martha Graham, who was by then a very famous modern dancer, choreographer, but also one of his former students and someone with whom he had shared the stage for many years. And they had a tremendous rift with one another, and Martha Graham's failure to recognize Shawn's own brilliance was something that deeply hurt him throughout his life. And so when he was telling this anecdote and stories about Martha Graham to John Doherty, he said, I have to stop. I have to stop here. This is going to kill me. And so they went to bed, and that night he had an aneurysm. So he went to the hospital. He survived it, but that whole process of trying to retell his life ended there. But what we're left with are all these clues and directions from those 8 days, which I took as a clue about how to reaffirm parts of his story that he really wanted to be told.
Well, with that cue, thank you for that. Why don't we pick up our hymnals here and turn to page 144 for a story about Martha Graham. Now, to be clear, this is maybe not one that he told to Doherty, or although maybe some of it came from those tapes.
He retold the story to Doherty. He did.
Yeah. So maybe you could read this, because I love this anecdote, and I should say first in introducing it, because I don't think the year is part of it, but this would have been in about 1922, I believe,
right. Mm-hmm.
When she was still part of the Dennis Shawn Company.
Right.
You got it? Starting with most of Shawn's days?
Okay. Yeah. I love this page. There's a photograph. It's one of the only ones I've ever found of Ted Shawn actually leading a class with Martha Graham as a student, which she wasn't a student at the time. She was posing as one. She was actually teaching with him. But most of Shawn's days in New York were spent with Horst. That's Louis Horst, who was the musical director for Dennis Shawn and also Graham's lover. Most of Shawn's days in New York were spent with Horst and Graham. They ate meals, attended performances, and created dances together. Shawn was surprised by how his relationship with Horst had developed during the tour. Writing to St. Denis, he remarked, "Louis' spirit on this trip is the finest I have ever known him. He is younger and sweeter in his nature than I could have imagined. He has been splendid to me and says that I have won his complete admiration and respect for the way I have acted under these repeatedly difficult situations. He has a very sweet friendship with Martha that is absolutely respectful and harmless." Shawn, which also tells you something about what Horst might have actually truly thought about Shawn. Shawn relied on them to successfully run the school and did whatever he could to keep them gainfully employed. He leveraged Mrs. Beardsley's connection to get him and Graham hired at the Gold Room of the Hotel de Beaux-Arts for $200 a week. Shawn was impressed with the offer. Over lunch at a restaurant close to the school, Shawn later proposed the idea that Graham work with the department store managers to give a recreational dance class to clerks and salesgirls. Graham outright refused, declaring that she was an artist and found his proposition degrading. Shawn was dumbfounded, unable to reason how she could refuse him while he was supporting both of them. According to Shawn's account of the ensuing fallout, this is a quote, "Her Royal Highness stood up from the lunch counter and screamed, 'You can't talk to me that way.' He grabbed the whole white tablecloth, pulled it off onto the floor, silver glassware and all, and ran screaming from the restaurant. And of course, poor fat waddly Louis merely got up and ran after her, and left me there with the irate proprietor and the customers looking." Shawn followed them to the cab and told them he never wanted to see them again. But the next morning, according to Shawn, Graham showed up at his penthouse at the Chatsworth, dropped to her knees, and started crawling across the floor. "Oh, Ted, Can you ever forgive me? I'm so mortified. I'm so ashamed of myself. Can you ever have the heart to forgive me and take me back into your love? I owe so much to you," and so on and so on. Shawn responded, "Oh, for God's sake, get up and dry your tears, and we'll start again fresh."
What a great anecdote. And it really does speak to how complicated their relationship was, because, of course, Graham had been really discovered by Shawn, and it was thanks to him that she had a career starting out. I mean, one wonders what would have, I mean, certainly with her drive, with her talent, she would have gotten somewhere regardless, but in terms of an entree into the dance world, that's what he provided.
I think Shawn was, the rift between Shawn and Graham was something that preoccupied him throughout his life. You found a letter from Graham to Shawn before Shawn heads off to the Oriental tour in 1925, which is a major clue about their relationship. It's a letter right after Graham leaves Denis Shawn, and she writes to Ted Shawn saying, "I'm leaving," I'm paraphrasing, but she uses, I think, the word love or "I love you" over 14 times in the letter, saying something about their connection. And I think at the time, before she had become a major force on the cultural scene, Shawn was, I think, upset and missed her. I think there was a rapport with one, but he was also offended because she was performing his dances that she created for him and wasn't receiving money or credit or anything. So there was also a sort of business arrangement that he felt that she had somehow betrayed, as well as a personal one.
Yeah, of course, the intricacies, let's say, of choreographic rights and so forth really were so unknown at that point in terms of what was okay for somebody to do, and you know, it's very complicated when you see that, yes, she was performing actual dances that she had performed with Denis Shawn and receiving remuneration for doing them. But even after she started doing her own work, it was so, in the beginning, it was so derivative of Denis Shawn. It was really, you see some of her early dances from the 1920s and you would swear you were looking at a Denis Shawn dance, not at a Graham work.
Right. And he brings this up to her at some point, and she says, when he finds out that she's teaching a class that was similar to the course that she taught under the rubric of Denis Shawn, and she said, "Fine, I will never teach anything that you ever taught me again." And Shawn says, "See, I'm responsible for your great movement invention."
Touché. I wonder, you mentioned the tour to the Far East, and there's another passage that I wonder if you could read to us. It's on page 216, and this I love because it really brings up some of the issues that were differently framed, I would say, at the time in the 1920s than they are today, ideas of cultural appropriation. But I think what you've written there, starting with the date on July 16th.
Okay, great. On July 16th, 1926, the company sailed for Java, where they spent more than a month. Under the sponsorship of Kunstkring, a members-only art society, Denis Shawn performed a slew of one-night stands within the organization's network of clubhouses throughout the island nation, each with a small theater that exclusively served its members. The Kunstkring officials extended Shawn and the company an invitation to join Dutch officials at the palace of the Sultan. On Sunday, August 8th, they were escorted into Kraton, the enclosed royal city within the city of Jakarta, then proceeded to the Golden Dance Pavilion where a traditional dance drama was already underway. Shawn could barely pull his attention away from the action for a formal introduction to the Sultan, who personally greeted each member of the company. Seeing Javanese court dancers at the royal palace was a highlight of Shawn's time abroad, rivaled only by a related experience he had the following month in Cambodia. An American diplomat in Saigon was able to secure an invitation for Shawn to attend a performance at the royal palace in Phnom Penh to attend the birthday celebration of King Sisowath, a staunch patron of the arts. St. Denis, Doris Humphrey, Charles Weidman, and Geordie Graham, Martha's younger sister, joined Shawn for a treacherous 6-hour car drive that involved 4 river crossings and required locals to carry the car on poles. They arrived at the palace, eager to secure front row seats in the Hall of Dance, the open-air pavilion on the palace grounds. Shawn described the performance he saw there as one of the most enchanting he had ever seen. In the process of trying to write about the highly stylized movement of the ancient Khmer dances, the exquisite and deliberate gestures, the hypnotic rhythms, the sense of floating and flying, he came to a broader realization about dance. As he watched the dances, likely trying to imagine how he might recreate a version of them for Denishawn, he arrived at the conclusion that we could never duplicate or recreate this dance art exactly. In the study of the dances of every nation and race in the world, I am never concerned with imitation, but with the surprising secret source of their charm and beauty, that I too may tap that source and let the divine essence flow through me, perhaps in new forms, to the world.
So that really, I think, sums up his conception of what he was doing in terms of seeing dances from these far-off places and bringing them to a larger audience, which is, what I'm finding today a difficult concept because people, I think for one thing, they don't recognize how obscure these dances were, and I think part of this, what this passage reflects, is the lengths that he had to go to even see this dance. So one was not YouTubing it at that point or seeing it in a way that we have instant access to authentic people doing these dances. It really was it required finding them in a sense.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. I think one of the hardest things to wrap my head around writing about Shawn was that it's a really complicated and relationship between all matters of appropriation, copying, notating, preserving. I mean, he was really making the rules up as they went along, because really in the time that Shawn was choreographing, there was really especially in the modern art, there was no notion of choreography that you owned and had authorship of. So he was really borrowing from other models of business and entrepreneurial, thinking about writers, thinking about visual artists. He was really borrowing models of authorship to understand what his relationship to his own work was. And then there's the added complexity of, one, he was often accused of stealing routines, but that was also the hallmark of the early theatrical history, was stealing dances from one another, not to justify it, but he was. And then there's the other added level about the bigger question about borrowing material that has sacred significance or cultural significance. This wasn't just a borrowing of commercial branding. It was really appropriating ideas and experiences that were specific to a culture or to a tradition. So, and he ran the spectrum on that. On the one hand, he was extremely respectful. He showed all of this, as you say, he went to these great lengths in search of authenticity. In 1923, he goes to Spain and to North Africa. This is at the height of the desert romance film in Hollywood, right?
Like and he Rudolph Valentino and that kind
exactly.
Of,
so there's a whole spate of films, and he says, I'm going to do this for the stage. This is going to make a killing. But instead of, in California, they were just going to, San Jose and going near palm trees and making up dances. Shawn says, no, I'm going to go to Tunisia. And so he, goes through the desert without understanding any language, a guide who could barely communicate with him. He takes a mail plane. I mean, he also drives escorted throughout the desert. I chronicled this whole trip. Takes a mail plane to a city that he wanted to see because there were the dancers of the Ouled Nail, which was women who danced in the Berber tribe that danced in the cafe concerts in the late 19th century that became the famous subject of Guy de Maupassant and all 19th century romanticists. And this tribe of dancing girls caught the cover of a National Geographic magazine when he was a young boy. And he saw this magazine, and he became entranced by it. And he remembered reading that they were dancers. And so then, decades later, he decides, I'm going to go find them. And so he does. And he's like, I'm going to learn their dances, and I'm going to bring them back for Denis Shawn. And he goes there. It's over 100 degrees. The women are not, this is generations after. They don't really understand why this American guy is coming and asking them to dance for him, and he has this thing called a camera that they want to photo. It was just so confusing to them. And so anyway, they go on the top of this building. He does find them. He goes to the top of a building, and it's sweltering hot. They have to wear these thick socks and shoes, which offended Shawn because the dance should have been done barefoot. And he takes these photographs, but the point is he meets all of these amazing dancers and goes to all these great lengths to find what he thinks is that original experience, because he had this abiding sense of what authenticity meant in dance. But he also, in that experience, also failed to see that many of these women were living, in poverty, that they were subject to these horrific colonial laws, that their dances were outlawed, that even talking to him put them in terrific jeopardy. So even though I think there was a noble, even ethical impulse he had as a choreographer, he also fell quite short as a sort of American going abroad, thinking that he could just, take a few photographs, have a quick experience, and come back and translate it. So it's really hard, because I think he had good impulses, but he also had, there were also negative consequences to his presence there. And I also want to say I think I go at lengths to try to understand and justify and also critique, Shawn's involvement in representing Asian and Indian and Native American dances on stage. But I do have to say, there are a few instances where it was just gross commercialism. When the Kachina dances of Southwest, in the U.S. Southwest were prohibited from, tourists were prohibited from taking photographs or from participating, or, there was a big tourist attraction. Shawn all of a sudden created his own Kachina dance because now it's really desirable, right? Forget about going into the festivals. You could come see Denis Shawn perform its own version of it. So he was also had different explanations for what he did to different audiences.
Mm-hmm. Well, it must be very complicated, I'm imagining, because you teaching at Barnard, you are, in a sense, bridging generations. I mean, you are taking this material that goes back more than 100 years and trying to explain it to people who are of the YouTube generation, who have must have a difficult time, I think, understanding just how remote areas of the world were 100 years ago, that you couldn't, even picking up a book was a difficult thing, let alone not being able to see moving images of them in the way that we can today. How do you make that translation, or how do you contextualize something that took place in a very different world?
Yeah, that's... I actually I teach one course on world dance history, where I have the impossible job of teaching dance throughout the history of the world, right?
In one semester?
One semester.
Yes, right.
And we do everything from sacred Afro-Cuban dance to, we're going to see river dance next week, the 25th anniversary. So it's a broad spectrum. But one thing one way I focus it, actually, is not surprising, not unrelated to Ted Shawn. My first day of class, I show these films of Burton Holmes. Burton Holmes was, he called himself the father of the travelogue, he was actually just a wealthy guy with a camera who traveled the world and went to remote places. But he had one of the first personal film cameras, and he also had made autochromes and other visual material. But he traveled the world and then came back to the United States and created these tourist productions that he called travelogues, where basically he would read his parts of his adventures and would show images from across the world. And in fact, his slogan was Burton Holmes, bringing the world home, right, pun on his name. Well, Shawn thought this was genius, and in many markets, Shawn followed Burton Holmes by a week after. So he would be in an auditorium or a library or a lecture hall, Burton Holmes, and the next week there would be Ted Shawn. Not only are we going to show you the images, we're going to bring them to life in dance, right? So it was a market that Shawn wanted to capture, this early 20th century fantasy of traveling to the remote places. Well, not only that, Ted Shawn actually reached out to Burton Holmes early in his career, and he knew that Burton Holmes had some of the first moving images of world dances, of Italian tarantella, the first images of what he called the hula hula, from a halau in Kona, one of the, so this was not tourist hula, this was from a traditional source. Dances from throughout the world, wherever he went, he had some clips of dancing, and Shawn said, I want that reel. And Burton Holmes actually edited a reel of clips of films that he had shot and gave it to Shawn. And Shawn used them to promote very early on one of his second schools in California, the Denis School. The announcement says, we have, he doesn't say Burton Holmes, but he says, but students will study real films of dances from across the globe. And that was actually Doris Humphrey, the famous modern dancer, said that was the right thing. When she read that, she said, oh, I want to go study at Denis Shawn. She had been on the East Coast, but she said, that's where it is, right? They're studying these world dances, and she wanted to be part of that. So Ted Shawn actually, Burton Holmes and his world and the sort of way that tourism, early tourist literature and culture influenced Shawn. But then the two of them met each other entirely serendipitously while Shawn was on that trip to Africa I mentioned before. He was on a train, and all of a sudden Burton Holmes came on board, and they said, you're Burton Holmes, you're Ted Shawn, you're the father of American dance, you're the father of the travelogue. And they started to travel with one another, and Shawn couldn't be more happy because he thought Burton Holmes, the world's most famous traveler, was entirely incompetent, and Shawn had to show him how to get around and use money, and that couldn't have made Shawn any more proud of himself.
Well, that film, or I guess a portion of that film, is something that we still have in the archives here, which makes sense that Shawn would have, this was an important possession to him, and so it became, something that he brought here with him.
Absolutely. And to answer your question, so I start with that film in a way because part of what I'm trying to teach, and part of the lesson we're learning, is that dances change all the time, but how we look at them change too, and who's looking, and when, and how, and for what purpose. So I look at this Burton Holmes as sort of just trying to sort out a history of, cross-cultural looking at dance, and looking at the sort of intersections between, ethnography and tourism, and how dance has really been the center of those sort of commercial and intellectual and political interests throughout the, really looking at the sort of history of global dance studies starting in the early 20th century on. So those films are really a really important document for that moment where dance history begins to crystallize.
Well, part of what it opens up for us, of course, too, is just the making us realize that how much is embedded in dance. That it's not just like, oh, these clever steps, or watch how high they can kick their legs. I mean, there are real cultural aspects to these dances, which Shawn certainly knew that were things. There was real meaning there. There was real cultural messages that were embedded in the movement of different cultures, and this is what part of what motivated him, right? To find ways to express those, and to also to embed those somehow in their own dances at a time when it makes you wonder in a way, and people have asked me certainly, well, like last summer when we had the Dance We Must exhibit here, and we were looking back at Denis Shawn in the early days and some of these dances that they did of other cultures, and people would say, well, what were other companies doing at that time, without realizing, well, there were no other dance companies. This was really the first American dance company, Denis Shawn. So if you were going to start with a blank sheet of paper, essentially to say, what should our repertory be? I think in a way it was a very global perspective to say, well, we should be looking around the globe to think about what we would do as Americans, because what are our traditions in this country? So in a sense, looking to the rest of the world to sort of say this is what dance is in our world.
Right. And also, part of that was remembering that Shawn had had an abiding devotion to the church, and the sort of religious strain and in his thinking about dance was very strong. He was in the seminary. He wanted to, he thought he would be a preacher, and he came to dance. His connection with Ruth St. Denis was largely over thinking about divine dance and sacred dancing, about how dancing was a pathway to godliness and to purity and joy and all of that. So his interest in dances abroad were largely that many of them were sacred dances, that they were connected to the temple or to dances of possession or dances of worship. So that was a lot of his interest. It wasn't necessarily in national dances, right? The sort of civic dances. They were really in the religious aspect of dance and how dance was a pathway for the divine. I deal with this a bit in the book. Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn were closet Christian scientists. I shouldn't say closet. They would have been very happily belonged to the church if the church would let them. But Ruth St. Denis, they were actually, but they read Mary Baker Eddy, and they were very, Shawn at different times in his life followed Christian scientists and really believed the ideas about the body, the division between the soul and the material body, and their letters to one another are all using the model of Christian Science as a way to understand what choreography is, that how the body is an expression of the divine. And that was one of his major choreographic tenets. And so even though he was working in some of the most commercial realms possible, there was always this religious aspiration in his choreography, spiritual.
So I wonder if in bringing this home, if we could look to page 400, the passage that you start with the chapter called Pillow of Stone, 1947 to 1971, page 400.
Thank you.
And if you would read those first two paragraphs there, because it really does bring it sort of home to where we are today, which I have to say is it's a great thrill to be able to have this conversation here at the Pillow.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Ted Shawn left no milestone unturned. Through his years as a director of the Jacob's Pillow Dance Festival and University of the Dance, he often identified an anniversary of some sort around which to organize a special program, a curtain speech, a fundraising effort, or a publicity campaign. Most of the celebrations had to do with Shawn himself, or one of his many firsts, though many were also related to landmark dates in the Pillow's own exceptional history. Commemorating the past was part of the Pillow ethos from its inception. For example, for the opening night of the theater in 1942, Shawn curated and installed an exhibition in the lobby to commemorate the first informal public tea dances held in 1933 with his men dancers, a gesture that was meant to mark the significance of the tea dances to the realization of the theater, as well as to honor the men themselves, nearly all of whom were enlisted in the military by that point. Foremost on Shawn's mind in the early years of transforming his men dancers' training camp into a school and festival was to ensure that his dancers had a place to return to and work after the war. Shawn's anniversaries, as Walter Terry had come to refer to the never-ending string of celebrations, were part of the work of building a legacy and inculcating institutional memory. For Shawn, they created a context for shared experience among Pillow students, performers, and audiences. They even oriented tourists and other dance novitiates into a history, introducing countless thousands to the notion that dance actually had a history. Plus, Shawn was hopelessly sentimental, a personality trait that imbued his lifetime time of dances and writings. Shawn's intense nostalgia for the Pillow's past was fueled by anxiety about his legacy. He celebrated his own personal and institutional achievements with urgency and intensity, knowing that recognition and adulation would come from nowhere else, at least not for quite some time. The Pillow's future was never assured, so he assiduously documented its milestone in articles, interviews, and the self-published souvenir booklet, How Beautiful Upon the Mountain, that was at the center of many fundraising campaigns.
Well, all I can say from that is how pleased he would be that here we are, almost 50 years after his death at this point, still talking about him, and really for the first time being able to understand so much, to have so much brought together into one place, into this wonderful book, which is for sale right over here at this table. And Paul will be signing it afterwards as well. So it's a remarkable achievement, and we are so grateful for you, to you, for having brought this together and brought it back to us here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Norton. Thank you all so much.